Welcome to Just Theory. In this episode, we are speaking with Aoife ODonoghue, Professor of International Law and Global Governance at Durham University. Professor ODonoghue is currently working on theories of tyranny and tyrannicide, and her upcoming monograph, Tyranny and the Global Legal Order, is due to be published later this year by Cambridge University Press. In this episode, we will be discussing tyranny, the role of experts in modern governance, and things that constitutional scholars should not take for granted. So without further ado, I present you Episode 2 on Tyranny. We're here with Professor ODonoghue. Aoife, thank you for joining us. We are absolutely delighted to have you here. And I must say that when we received the proof of your book, I had the best time reading it. I think it's incredibly well written. And this is something that we've been talking to Emilia about for a long time, about accessibility of scholarship and how especially the old school academics try to make things too complicated. I say that it's a complex of either an old school academic or a grad student writing in very complex language. The book is titled On Tyranny and the Global Legal Order. It will be published by Cambridge University Press this year or next year?
In next month, hopefully.
And it's
so October 2020, what year are we? 2021, October 2021.
Amazing. And it's definitely a great addition to anybody's bookshelf. But before we begin and before we dive into your book, I was wondering about your motivations to join academia and stay in academia.
So my original plan when I joined, so I did my law degree in Cork, which is also where I'm from, and I never wanted to practice law. So that was never a motivation for doing the law degree. I thought law would be, I was always interested in history and politics. And I thought that law would be a good way of kind of doing all of that. And originally I wanted to be a diplomat. So that was sort of I did a lot of international law because I thought, being a diplomat, knowing lots of international law would be very useful for that. But I discovered as I was doing the degree really that there was no area of law that I didn't enjoy. So, areas I don't do any research in, like land, for instance. I enjoyed doing it. I enjoy the technical aspects of law. I enjoyed the theoretical aspects of law. From doctrinal through to deconstruction or law and literature. I like it. I get a lot out of law. And particularly the political and the theoretical ends probably more than the others. But so when I always thought I would do a master's, that was always on the cards. And I did my master's, and then I did the civil service exam. So I was still on the course. And what happened is several of my friends started getting academic jobs and started doing PhDs. And I hadn't really thought about it from up to then. And I thought, well, maybe I would like doing that job. I had taught swimming for years, so I had taught things. So and I liked that. I liked engaging with people. Obviously, it's a very different thing. It's a very physical thing to teach, so it's a different approach. So a job came up in NYU Galway, and I was very lucky. I got the job, and I really enjoyed it. I was teaching, not in my area of research, but I really enjoyed teaching those areas as well. And I started writing. And I got the job in Durham, and it's a job I think that suits me, and it doesn't suit everybody. You have to, like, for legal academic, I do a lot of big projects with lots of people, but Tyranny was entirely on my own in a room reading loads of books, and I get a lot out of that. I really enjoy it. And I do enjoy teaching. I get a lot from the students. They're great, undergrad, postgraduate. They always say something unexpected.
I found it absolutely fascinating that you mentioned that your inspiration or your original aspiration was to become a diplomat. And that aspiration transpires in your book to a large extent, I suppose, because I'm not sure if I'm right about it, but there is a call for finding a middle ground in this book, for finding a way of doing a better international law in general, to be more critical about it and to be more coming up with the solutions and positive outlook for international law. And perhaps we can kind of dive into the book now and to the main central thesis of your project. If I understood your project correctly, the central thesis or the central claim is that modern developments in democratic, liberal international law very often are perceived as free from tyranny, free from any negative influences. It's antithesis of tyranny. However, your claim is that even human rights development, humanitarian intervention, all that has a potential for tyrannical elements. Is that correct? Is that your central claim in the book, or how would you describe the main motivation for the book and the central thesis or the central claim in the book?
That's a really good synopsis, probably better than I would be able to manage it myself. Yeah, absolutely, because I think from the outset when I started to do international law, I was always had a kind of nagging feeling that it doesn't actually work for most of the world. For most of the world, it doesn't work. And for most of the world, it can have an extremely negative impact. You just have to look at Afghanistan and the amount of international law that got, in various different ways, where it doesn't. I'm going right back to the Soviet invasion, that it's. And for me, it took me a while to find a way of describing it, of articulating exactly what I thought the problem was. And I've done quite a lot of work on constitutionalization and global constitutionalism.
Mm.
And where I came to tyranny was that it was really good. I was in a Hannah Arendt reading group actually with loads of political geographers, and that was really good. But she uses the word tyranny quite a lot, and that's quite unusual for modern political theorists. Obviously there's Arendt and there's Strauss and Koyev, but there isn't a huge amount of use. Other words are used that mean the same thing, but there isn't a huge amount of use of the word tyranny. And it really struck me that kind of the base of liberal constitutionalism, and I would say the same with the global order as it is with the domestic order or regional orders, is an attempt to stop tyranny. So if you're going right back to the Greeks, obviously it changes and it morphs, and it's different if you're talking about medieval era, and it's different if you're talking about now to when you're talking about the American Revolution. But there is this sort of idea that if we just come up with a perfect system, it'll stop it. And it is just the legal, and lawyers, of course, because we're very self-confident, a legal system will fix it. And it struck me that, is that why international law started using constitutionalism? I'm trying to figure out why did we start using language of there isn't a separation of powers. So why did we all of a sudden try to find one? There isn't an executive. So why are we insistent there's a rule of law when there isn't one? And it seemed to me that, well, if you can say it's constitutional, then it's not other things. Because if you're talking about a legal order, and we all think liberal or democratic or republican constitutional orders, whichever is the variety you like, or socialist, is the right system. And international law is not that. Well, what is it? It's an illegal order without another kind of descriptor. And where I started from was there is the reason we are grasping for constitutionalism, because actually, if we think about what exists in a tyrannical order, things like rule by law, illegitimacy, silence, you will find it in international law. And it's a way of papering over things by using the language where it doesn't exist.
So in other words, international law and the language of the rule of law, separation of powers, is just a facade to conceal a pure operation of power and power politics. Is that correct?
And law. So I think it's important when I'm saying that it's not that I'm saying there isn't any law. There's loads of law. There's laws everywhere. The argument is not that there isn't a legal order, there's a political order, because tyrannies are full of law.
Right.
But there's law everywhere in a tyranny. I mean, if you think of the kind of ones people think of, the classic, we're going to talk about, Rome, or you're going to talk about Cromwell, or whoever you're going to talk about, right? There'll be George III. There's a lot of law. There's always law, but it's ruled by law.
So perhaps this is very interesting what you said, because in the introduction, you emphasized that actually there is no clear definition of tyranny to begin with. And I just wondered, before we proceed with this claim, could we just unpack the definition of tyranny, or how would you define tyranny?
Well, I think one of the most important elements of it is illegitimacy. The attainment of power, and how that power to make law, right, to adjudicate, enforce, whatever way we want to think about the ways we think about how we, constituted power holders use law, the way that is gained in the international order. And I'm not here talking about the interstate international order. I don't think that's how it works. I don't think that's ever actually how it works. How law is made. So one of the examples I use in the book is the Security Council counter-terrorist lists. So how that system is created, how it's operationalized, how an individual person's life can be completely paralyzed with no system to, there is now an ombudsperson, but it's extremely hard to get off that list. Once you're on that list, it's very hard. Gavin Sullivan has an excellent book describing in a lot of detail, that power, and that power that you're enforcing on that individual is illegitimate. And I think that is really critical to tyranny, and how you get that power, and then how you operate the power. Because you can get law legitimately or get power and legal authority legitimately and then become a tyrant. That's also possible. So you could say the Security Council, within the terms of its own reference, did get the authority in a legitimate way, but then it's exercised. So for me, that's really, really important. The rule by law element of it as well is extremely important, that the people making, or the system, or the actors making the law are themselves not bound by that law. They're not those laws. And I think that's, in development, I think that's really important, right? Because, the things that we insist the majority world do, but that we don't insist, if austerity is probably a very good example, the things that we expect of some groups and don't expect of other groups. So there's this sort of, or, we expect transparency, but we don't get any, if you're a major power, you don't have to, comply with that, no matter who you are. So that's two very important elements, but also things like silence. In tyrannies, there tends to be silence. That silence can come from fear. It can come from poverty. If you're Donald Trump, it can be by setting the Twitter mob. Obviously, he's not on Twitter anymore, but he sets the mob on you. And are you going to speak up if you're a woman and you say to Donald Trump, "I don't think you're a offended woman," and then you get rape threats on Twitter? That's that kind of silencing effect. And we don't hear from the majority of the world. We don't hear from people. We don't hear about. So there is lots of silence. By silence, I don't mean strict silence, but what I mean is there can be a cacophony of noise. There can be lots of bluster, but actual, like the public space isn't there, and that's also really important. Also, it's very gendered. Tyranny is always has been extremely gendered. If you go right back to the Greeks, and a lot of problems for women, I think, probably comes from the Greek philosophers, if you look back, but they would argue that women are the ultimate cause of tyranny. They call, because democracy means all the women get a say, and women are daft, so they will cause, or a woman automatically in power is a tyrant. Just on a very empirical, basic level, if how many women leaders have there been, and how many of them have actually been tyrannical, as opposed to male leaders, Though I would reject any idea that, there is a very strong train of thought in tyrannical discussion that everyone has the potential to be a tyrant. And I reject that. I don't think everybody has the potential to be a tyrant. I think that's based on a very stereotypical idea of a particular type of power-based understanding of individuals that I don't think is correct. So that's not an exhaustive list, but those things I think are some of the key aspects of it, with fear as well. It doesn't have to be fear of violence. Sometimes it is. It can be fear of poverty. It can be fear of a whole range of things. It doesn't have to be, but for me, they're kind of the key. So I use a taxonomy in the book. I probably could have come up with a short, pithy definition of tyranny, but I think tyranny morphs. And part of this was, of course, during the first half of the book, which was, it's a historical overview of various theories of tyranny at various different times. And, tyranny will look different in the 21st century than it looked in the 18th century. Tyranny will look different depending on what part of the world you were in, and, what kind of way that the illegitimacy has come about. So it's not that I think definitions in and of themselves, and also, they will also deploy different parts of it, like whether or not you need to use physical violence to instill the fear, or is poverty in this particular scenario a better way of doing it? Is it better to do it that way to achieve your tyranny? So, I think the morphing to suit, tyrants tend to be very canny, that's how they manage to get the power.
There are just so many points that kind of I would love to develop. I don't know if Aleksandra wanted to intersect at this.
Oh, I've been just listening, fascinated.
Yeah, I just don't know where to start. Aleksandra, you go first.
I think one note that I made while reading your taxonomy was that it's very difficult to reconcile all those different definitions and to know that people are actually talking about the same thing. So to me, especially with, ancient Rome, tyranny was a form of governance, as opposed to what it is in common parlance now. A tyrant can be domestic tyrant. It can be, we call tyrants people who we don't like, or if we don't like their mode of governance. And I wonder how to reconcile that, because to me, what tyranny is a certain unilateral exercise of power, more than anything else. So I would argue that, and I would have to think about it, but now you talked about legitimacy, and I wonder if there can be a legitimate tyranny, if there can be a system that's tyranny that uses a legitimate legal order. Because whether we argue, laws that are under totalitarian regimes, whether they are legitimate or not, that's another discussion, right? So if we view them as illegitimate, then of course the entire system, we can delegitimize the entire system. But I wonder if it's possible to have a tyranny that we can not rationalize, but legitimize through the laws. And I think that constitutionalism, you are right. And I think that that's a certain intuition that I've developed while reading your book, that there is an element of constitutionalism that seeks to legitimize tyrannical impulses.
So great, there's a lot of things in there. So I would say that tyranny is a form of governance. So I actually don't think that's changed. I think we've stopped using the word, and we use the word like we use totalitarianism more. What really annoys me is the idea of illiberal constitutionalism. If it's illiberal or it's barbaric, or that's not constitutionalism. Like, I find definitions of constitutionalism where democracy doesn't have to be present. And I know, speaking from the UK, that's a controversial point with parliamentary sovereignty. But to me, that's not constitutionalism. And Strauss, I have a lot of problems with Strauss, but one of the points he makes that I thoroughly agree with is that we are afraid to call something a tyranny. And I do think it is a form of governance, like democracy, or like anarchy. I do think it is a type of governance. I don't think it's a personal description of a particular person or a group. I think it is a form of governance, like same as democracy or any of the rest of them. So I think Strauss is right there that we should start using it. And I think part of the reason we don't use it is I talk about tyrannophobia, which Hobbes came up with, and he's like, you don't like strong government, and that's because you're a tyrannophobe, and that shuts people down, right? Because he makes jokes in the book, in the right, and he's making jokes of people who have tyrannophobia, because tyrannophobia is a foolish fear, right? Phobia is a foolish fear. They're very real. Phobias are real, but they're foolish. Or I mean, we all should be afraid of killer spiders, but there's a level of and I do think from that it's become. You can't call it what it is. And it becomes acceptable to call some people, Kim Jong-un or Lukashenko, sure, but who, Donald Trump or America more generally? And it's, how many coups was it behind? The sort of like there's a fear of using the word because you will look foolish. And I think I think that, in fairness, that it has changed a bit since I started writing. So when I started doing this in 2016, nobody was using it. By the time Trump left his presidency, a lot of people were using it. So there has been a change, and Modi and Putin, and there have been changes in that. So I do think it is a form of governance. I think it is a way of going about ruling rule by law. I think it's illegitimate. I think there's years of fear. There is no public sphere, proper public contestation. I think there are monikers for it, and one of the things, and what I also think is interesting, and this is very much an international lawyer's perspective, is that you're right about them not losing legitimacy, but other states, so if we talk about Somalia in the late 1990s, the early 2000s, it was a failed state. So if you go to the other extreme, right, and you don't have an overwhelming barbaric government that do awful things to you, you do lose your legitimacy. But if you do have an overwhelming barbaric state, we'll still tell you the constitutional order and are completely legitimate. Like that there's this sort of one thing we will name, the other thing we won't name. And of course, I don't in the book talk about the consequences of what it would be for a state, because I am more interested in the book. And outside of the book, fair enough, but in the book, I'm very much about calling non-state systems tyrannies and using that language to describe what's going on elsewhere, and not just sort of orientalizing it and saying it's happening over there and it's a particular kind of states and it's a particular type of people. And because one of the things that really struck me when I was reading the stuff on tyranny, like how many times I'd read about how certain people, it's natural, and people still say that, right? You still get people who will say that all the time about lots of places. Oh, it's natural for the Russians to live under an authoritarian. So I'm like, it's not natural anywhere.
This is my biggest pet peeve, I swear, when people try to normalize things that are completely not normal, and it's just obtuse. It's bothersome. But yeah, I mean, all that you've said, absolutely agree. But I think there's an element of value-latedness that makes those conversations very difficult. And almost the same thing is happening with democracy, and almost the same thing is happening with constitutionalism. So I am growing progressively more concerned with how people use terms like rule of law or, democracy, and how they just start meaning whatever any partisan actor wants them to mean and dilutes the meaning. And I think the same kind of happened with tyranny as well. And I predict that, and I can say that now because it's our podcast, so I can say it, but I predict that the same is going to happen with tyranny. So this connotation with, an order or a disorder that stifles societal progress, that's a unilateral exercise of power, that's illegitimate, people are just going to start using it as, just another way of another mode of governance. Oh, it's just like democracy, only for different kind of people. And it's so dangerous because there are so many demagogues who are willing to exploit that actively. Like they're not going to even, I think soon people will just make tyranny trendy, it's cool to be Putin.
I do think that has happened to an extent, but what I do find always interesting is that they all still cling to the idea that they have a constitutional order. Like they all will cling to it. And I do think and I have a problem with legal academia for acquiescing it and just giving it a different kind of label and calling it things like a liberal constitutionalism. And I do think as academics, it's incumbent on us to say, actually, no, that's not constitutional. To actually be blunt with it as opposed to redefining it and saying, oh, you can, of course, be a constitutional order or not. And yeah, historically, you could be a constitutional order with no democracy. Now, the 21st century, you can't. Like I think as we have to, I think it is an imperative, because I think the value element is also really important, because for me, like again, this is very much an international lawyer's point, but humanitarian intervention is a very good example for all the wrong reasons, right? They will name someone a tyrant, and then they will go in. And in the section in tyrannicide in particular, I was trying to make the point that the naming of the tyrant and the decision about what to do with it, because I do think I would agree with Strauss that to fix it, you have to name it. You have to call it what it is. But this is a bugbear of mine about talking about constituted power. It is the constituent power holders who get to decide what happens. It's not for somebody hundreds and hundreds of miles away to decide, oh, this person's a tyrant and we're going to go in and save them, because nobody ever gets saved. People only ever die, and the country is never left in a better position. There are no examples anywhere where this ends up being better. So it's to me, it's important to name it, but also for the people to name it. It's for Syrians to call their leadership what they think it is. It's for Russians to say and it's for, Americans and African Americans for a very, very long time have been saying they live in a tyrannical order. You know, they have not that's what Black Lives Matter, but it's also what the civil rights movement was about. You know, it's saying, it's naming it. They have been naming it. But I think it's important then, I think from an academic perspective, especially those of us who do theory and public law, to name it as it is, as opposed to just finding another label. Or because I do think, as you say, there's been a serious denuding of, and international lawyers would want to stop using we're used to the word rule of law. There is none. And it's a denuding of the word to stretch it to cover something where it doesn't exist.
I just wonder if this actually touches upon Strauss's strong or prevalent theme about relativity of value and the fact that what constitutes legitimate or illegitimate legal order, or who will be named or labeled a tyrant, is relative to the context in which the claim is being actually made and asserted. So that's actually quite prominent in Mickiewicz work. This kind of relativity of tyranny and relativity of the value, which is employed to name the tyrant. And I just wondered how in your project, how do you deal with that relativity of what's good, what's bad? Because obviously Western democracies, constitutional orders often assume they are the ultimate deciders of what's good, what's bad. So how do you approach relativity of values if we have the Taliban government claiming they are not tyrants, they are just bringing in the order that has been always the case, has been always the correct order in their country? How do you deal, or how does your project address relativity?
Well, I think on the Strauss point, of course, because Strauss, it's probably easiest for Strauss. Strauss is on the page, says the Judeo-Christian systems are better. He's very clear about that. He's very orientalizing. He is sort of the epitome of the white Western man who thinks this system is the best system, and never mind what both of them had lived through and why Strauss had to leave Europe. But like that, for me, like Strauss, I mean, it's very Judeo-Christian American view, even though he wasn't an American, of them being at the pinnacle of a system and they have the best system. And yeah, it's relative because those people are different. To me, that there's a straight line back from Strauss to all the orientalization that was happening in the somehow that we are all very different. And I mean, I'm an intersectional feminist. I do think, people have different lived experiences and they have different, but the idea that some people naturally like tyranny, I mean, that's like, like women naturally women naturally don't like anything. There's sort of people like security, people like to live, and I have a section about the benefits that can come from tyranny. People sometimes accept a system because they're like, well, I have food, I have a job, there is a healthcare system, and it's particularly if they've come out of a period of economic hardship or war or whatever reason, people can go. I mean, you could say that, say with the Taliban, people have been, well, the Americans have been flying over us with drones and killing people randomly for years, so fine, the Taliban. Like, you can see people going rationalizing that in their head, but the ultimate benefits always come to the tyrant. And that's the difference, right? That like the people who will do the best out of it in Afghanistan are the Taliban. So if you're a woman, you might go, well, at least there isn't a drone flying over me. But also, as a woman, the ultimate benefit of that system is the Taliban. The people in power are the people who get all the benefits from the system. So what I would say I think it's a bit easier with Strauss. I think with Mickiewicz, it's a bit more complicated because I think Mickiewicz had a much more nuanced idea of what relativity. And to me, I think I'm probably closer to a view, because I think the problem, and if we use the humanitarian intervention example and the Afghanistan example here, is that the response to, no, of course, that wasn't why they invaded Afghanistan. It wasn't to bring down the Taliban. It was, it wasn't to save the women. That was all came up with afterwards, and they all abandoned it again. But that sort of idea of going in and saving people because you know better, that is liberalism at its worst. to me, and that is why I think for the global legal order, because of course I would agree, right? Tyranny is different no matter where you are in the world. It has its own history. I mean, I do a Western political theory history. That is not the only history of tyranny you could do. There's a lot more different and complicated, and I think lots of, I'm looking forward to other work on it. But I think the global legal order is the European legal order that was spread everywhere else. Constitutional order that is around the world is the order we spread to imperialism around the world. So there is a link actually between tyranny, constitutionalism, and imperialism that is based within the European imperial, say, like the UK, people in the UK sometimes claim, our greatest export was the common law. Okay. But
certain
I'm sure
parochialism as well, I suppose, that plays out.
And the global legal order is a European invention, but it is everywhere now. So it is everywhere as a system.
Since we with Koyevs, could I just very briefly touch upon his work on tyranny and wisdom, and the idea that the tyrant can or sometimes will be guided by the advice of the philosopher or by the advice of the experts. And I wonder if, especially in times of pandemic today, when we are surrounded by experts who provide us guidance on how to act, is that a potential for exploitation by the tyrant and a way to legitimize their action? So it's not just the law itself that sometimes legitimizes the tyrant's action. Sometimes the tyrant will rely on the expert or the philosopher or the wise person. And how much accountability does the philosopher has, or does the expert has in this? Or is that just the way of dispersing responsibility and saying there is no one to be blamed here, because here is the executive, the decision maker, and here is just the expert who just tells us objective truths. So no one really holds responsibility in a sphere that suddenly became just a vehicle of power. So I just wondered if you have any thoughts of this.
Can I just quickly add to that before we move on? Because I had a very similar thought as well. So my thought was about scientism and using pseudoscience frequently. And, we live in a fake news world, right? Post-truth reality, as they keep telling us, where people need to know that science changes, and that's okay. Facts that are given to us today or yesterday, there is a right for the researchers. We should be seeking the truth, right? But I think there is this kind of sentiment for stability and for order that people just want they want certainty in life. And it's the same impulse, I think, that you just described with the regimes that take over after, periods of war or periods of terror, right? That when they move under tyranny, people just want stability. And I wonder if that passion for scientism isn't, like Emilia said, exploited to establish tyranny, but do it in a sneaky way. So you can always say, it's not us, it's them. These are find a group of experts that agrees with you and say, this is what they said. And it's the same that what the Nazis did, right? They had an entire array of experts that would say that certain race was better than others.
Yeah, a global group of experts too. They were everywhere who would have said that, and some of them still today, of course. So I think I suppose which bit to start with. So I think because I think they're really important points, right? The role of the expert and the role of the advisor. And I'm going to mention Hegel, and this is really dangerous territory here now because I know Emilia is going to jump on, and I'm not a Hegel expert. So, but what I found was interesting in the when Koyev was talking about the wisdom and that slave master dichotomy, for me, really said a lot about, because I talked a bit about the fear, but tyrants also live in fear, right? They can't trust anybody. They can't actually trust anything anybody says to them. So the idea of the wisdom and the advisor becomes difficult because, in the play, it's difficult to figure out whether or not the wise person is telling you this because, as a tyrant, they're telling you this because it's the truth, or they're telling you this because you're the tyrant and they live in fear. So they are telling you this in order for you to accept, or maybe modifying this, not giving you the full. And that tyrants, that, and I think it's really interesting that the idea that the slave master dichotomy there, that Aoife says, a tyrant can never be fully satisfied because he can never get the recognition from the slave of it because he's never sure, or she's never sure. And I think that's really important when we talk about those relationships with experts. And even with COVID, it's really interesting if you look at like Putin, I think, is in self-isolation at the moment versus Trump, right? So both of them, and yet have very different, and I would imagine that's also something culturally about, I've spent very little time in Russia, but, about science and the attitude towards science and et cetera, versus, the sort of trajectory, say, the US is on with regard to fake news, et cetera. So I think the use, and I think this is where lawyers, and I think it's incumbent on us to not lay the groundwork. And Mark Lilla's work on the tyrannophilia, I think here is really important, in that saying, and we can make a point about the impact strategy for academics in the UK, right? But that you have a theory or you have some science and you see somebody who's an avatar for it. So the eugenicists, right? They saw this group will do the thing I want them to do, and they'll allow me to do the things that I want to do. So I will align myself with this group because they will achieve the thing I want to. And I think with law that happens too, right? There's, this group, and I mean, Lilla talks about Schmidt and Heidegger, and I think they're, Schmidt probably slightly more than Heidegger. The other examples he uses, I don't think the connection. I think he could have found better people on the left, like he uses Koyev, and I'm like, that's nonsense. But I think he just needed to pick some other people on the left there, and left people can be tyrannophilic, just same as the right. Mark Lilla, I think, picks the wrong people in his book. But that's sort of, you find an avatar to fulfill your purpose, and sometimes that's law, that's political, that's somebody like Schmidt. Sometimes it's a scientist, right? You can get X, Y, and Z done. And if you think about what the Americans did, say, after World War II with the Nazi scientists and going to, building rockets, there's those scientists really, I don't know much about the detail of this, but, there was this group, they were willing to fund my project. Oh, this other group here is willing to fund my project, and they're all willing to fund my project. And I'm not really interested in the fact that I am buttressing or giving legitimacy to a particular order. And I do think that expert, the Plato and Syracuse, it never works out. It never works out very well. It didn't, that is one of the issues I have with international law, that we are forever coming up with explanations and reasons. Somebody tweeted, a very funny tweet about how the Taliban hadn't adopted constitutionalism despite all those conferences on Taliban and constitutionalism, that there has to be a reality check on how much we achieve, because we don't achieve a lot, but also when we do use our work and our work gets used, how it gets used, and if it's used in ways to buttress or give legitimacy to tyrannical systems, that we need to be very clear ourselves and our own culpability and say no. And I would include that on naming things, and stop using the word liberal constitutionalism, please.
You also mentioned Hirsch in your book and the idea of juristocracy. And now that we started speaking about experts, so my recent project discusses the idea that we started treating judges as legal experts rather than adjudicators. Mm-hmm. And there is an entire UK Supreme Court agenda that kind of illustrates that, go out there and preach about how wonderful the court is and how great we are and how we're saving everybody, right? And I wonder if there is, or if we can, thinking about local legal orders and national legal orders, but also international legal orders in terms of the tribunals and the courts that operate on an international scale, I wonder if there is an element of tyranny in or rather judicial tyranny, that, there is a certain assertive judgment and you have to comply. So whether it's legitimate or not, we can argue later, right? Whether you think that our arguments are right or wrong. And when you look back at the history of the US Supreme Court, especially, Korematsu, let's say, right? That was not the best decision in a history of the judiciary, to say the least. But it's a kind of ex post facto rationalization in a way, because you have to live with this judgment and you have to live with in the order that doesn't really overthrow the judiciary. This is not something that happens. And despite what, you know, the Judicial Power Project is saying that, oh, maybe we can just overthrow them. We can't really. We just live with the court. This is just what it is.
It's an interesting one in international law. I probably have, because who has to follow the rules depends on who you are, right? So like all the US did with the WTO, which was I have problems, right, with the dispute settlement body and its decisions, say around development or around the environment, etc. But like people were following those rules and they were fighting against the US. So the US basically has hobbled it now, right? The appeal system isn't working. So I think it depends on who you are and whether or not you have to follow the rules. I mean, the UK is consistently ignoring the Chagos Islands decision. It's ignoring it. It's not going along with it. So I think there are definitely scenarios where the International Court makes whichever one we're talking about, whether or not it's the ICJ or the European Court of Human Rights. You know, we talk about prisoner voting. I'm loving Colin Murray's research, but you know, they just ignore it, right? So it depends on who you are. There's the people who have to follow it, and then there's the people who have to ignore it. And I think there is a big difference there. I also think that I think from women's perspective in the US, there was far too much reliance on something like Roe versus Wade to save you. You should never, ever, ever. I think this is just about a political decision. I feel much more secure as an Irish woman knowing that we changed the Constitution than I would if it had been the decision of the Irish Supreme Court. That's not what the courts are there to do. Now, I have a lot of problem with the Judicial Power Project in the UK. I think they have a very particular agenda, and that agenda is not a positive one with regards to lots of things, right? They are blaming the court system in the UK for things which the court system is just the courts didn't introduce the Human Rights Act. That was a political decision, and it came out of the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland and is badly needed in the UK. Just that there's a sort of an idea that the UK is this bastion of rights, and you know, ask anyone from Northern Ireland, it's not. So it is much better now, obviously. But so I do think courts are important. They do a very important thing. When we rely on courts to save people and to fix things, and I think this happened after Guantanamo Bay. You know, everyone again was relying on the US Supreme Court to get all those people out of Guantanamo Bay, and Guantanamo Bay is still open. You know, people rely on the International Criminal Court to get justice for people. I mean, how many people have they convicted so far? I mean, and everyone's from Africa. So like it's when courts have a very important role. And one of the most important roles with regards to tyranny, I think, is judicial review, and there is no such thing in international law. And I think that's one of my issues with the global legal order and the complete absence. And it doesn't even have to be a court doing some kind of review, but somebody somewhere doing something review. There is no way to review a Security Council decision. There is nowhere you can go and ask, was that decision legitimate? And I do think judicial review is really important. Now, separation of powers, you know, it can be 5 things, it can be 6 things, it can run in different ways. There's no one way of doing it. But I do think review is really important. And do courts get it wrong? Sure. Do we? But I think in international law in particular, there has been, and you can see it in individual courts as well, in different nation states, the reliance, and I think it's a common law thing, I think probably more than a civil jurisdiction thing, where there is just a reliance on the court to save you. Do you think like they can save you sometimes, and they can be brilliant sometimes? They can also be awful. And I would, from the feminist judgments perspective, I think I probably have more respect for judges having done a feminist judgments project, because I think I have a better understanding of how hard it is to write a judgment. Like it's really hard, and they get very little training. And it's really hard. It's been easier in the US Supreme Court because you load of clerks. But so I think courts are important. I have problems with the Power Project. I think they have it's not about the courts. It's about a very particular agenda of getting rid of judicial review, of leaving the executive frankly, the executive in the UK constitutional order has enough power. It has plenty of power.
I agree. You don't have to convince me by any stretch of imagination. But I completely. There's a certain trend to diminish judiciary and use the word tyranny and describe them as tyrants, even though their power actually is quite limited. Yeah. And it's this dehumanizing practice of, you know, once you are in power, you are not a person. even though people, obviously everybody's human, everybody makes mistakes and everybody makes decisions. But Emilia, do you have any questions?
Yeah, I actually wanted to touch upon precisely the aspect that you've highlighted and which Aoife emphasized earlier on, that tyranny is a form of governance, not a person. I'm not quite sure if this distinction can be firmly made. If you can divorce decision-making process at the governing level or the level of governance from people who make those decisions. Aoife, you mentioned that it takes a certain person to be a tyrant. So I wonder if we should even go back to diagnostic and statistical manual of psychiatry to look for the definition of a tyrant. Is it a psychopath or narcissist? Are we all somewhere on the spectrum of that desire to impose our decisions on others? And of course, if you use that manual, you can use very many useful characteristics to define a tyrant. You said that the tyrant is never satisfied. It's like a narcissist requiring narcissistic supply to survive. So there is some kind of, or the fact that a psychopath cannot requires again finds it difficult to sustain lasting relationships. This is true of a tyrant as well. It's difficult for a tyrannical order to maintain lasting relationships. So I just wondered if there is a psychological element, after all, to this project of governance that you're trying to embark upon in your book.
But I think there is for everything. I think a Democrat also is a type of person. I an anarchist is also there's anarchy and there's an anarchist, right? And certain personalities, and I did have a look actually when I wrote an article on Donald Trump, and I had a look at some of the there isn't a huge amount written. There was a lot written actually in 2016, and then there was a lull, and then there's stuff being written again. So there was an article I read. People were analyzing his tweets and looking at what markers for whether he's a sociopath or whatever he is. But I would also say that there isn't you could also have a group. I mean, probably the 30 tyrants of Athens, like Hitler didn't do it on his own, right? He wouldn't have done it without Himmler, and international law, like it's the Security Council is a group of people, like the hegemony is created by groups of people. It can be sort of a lone person, but it very rarely is, right? Like, so, and I do think there are types, sure, there's personality traits. But if we went back 300 years ago, like, those personality traits would have been pushed other directions as well. I think, the personality traits, but then also the robustness of the system, which is like one of the points I really try to make in the book is about public contestation and a fully functioning public sphere, because those kind of people are less likely to get into power if you have a proper functioning and the limits of law and the limits of constitutionalism. Constitutionalism won't stop tyranny. At the end of the day, it won't. What will stop it? Like what stopped Donald Trump firing that God never his name, the man in charge of COVID, the very elderly man.
Fauci.
Oh my God.
Anthony Fauci? No.
Fauci was actually, he's very well respected and generally and popular, and he was saying, and it was impossible. He had legally was entitled to fire the man. He didn't fire the man because the public wouldn't have accepted him doing it. And the public contestation is really important in that sense, because I think that's what will stop. Any leader anywhere, fully democratically elected, will have an ego. I mean, heads of law schools have egos. People who lead academic projects have egos, right? We all have this sort of, but I'm not sure that there is a particular personality type. And I think the political culture in different countries at different times will be better at producing it. And also I think there's a duality here. And I talk about this in the book about places that are, democratic at home, but tyrannical abroad. And there's a lot of Western states like that, right? Who are perfectly, and that's the same person.
Yeah.
If we're talking about the executive, well, we'll pretend they're all presidential orders. But if you're talking about, that's one person who on one sphere follows, rule of law, is tied in by judicial review, is regularly elected, does all the things. On the other hand, is bombing and killing people over here and taking away the natural resources. It's the same person, right? But the same person.
The same person who takes pictures with kids and bombing Yemeni children. Yeah.
Yeah, same. And will sell plenty of weapons to people who do it every day. It's the same. It's the same person. Or the same group, because I do think it's very rarely I'm anywhere. It's very rarely one person. Very rarely one person. I think force of someone's personality can have a lot to do with it. But it is. Unless we're talking about like within a very small, and I would say even the private sphere in the home or something, I think that's, where the natural tyranny lies, as the Greeks would have us, well, the Athenians, I should say, not all the Greeks. The Athenians, where man is the tyrant, and that's the natural place, because women should live under tyranny. So I do think that duality brings into question whether or not there is this sort of type. There's a Netflix series, The Tyrant, at the moment, which is interesting, right? Because it does do that kind of like, not from a legal perspective, but from a political perspective, what are the things that they all tend to do? Like, how do they all tend to get into power? How do you hold on to power when you're there? It's more like a kind of, it's tongue in cheek, but it's kind of a like The Prince on Netflix in ways. But even amongst those 6 they pick, they're all personality-wise, I would say, they're not all that alike. That there is this. I mean, Joseph Stalin, and I'm not sure would he get on well with Kim Jong-un? Who knows? So like it's a. I mean, I suppose he got on with his grandfather.
I don't think he would like any competition around him. That's the main thing.
No, he didn't like it. No.
probably that would be hard for a tyrant to cope with a similar personality just around him. And I'm very mindful of time, actually. So I know that Aleksandra had very quick questions to wrap up the interview.
Yes. So what the aim of these 5 questions is to ask every guest the same set, so we can start putting together kind of a knowledge base for aspiring scholars and for early career academics to get inspired. So the first question is, who or what was your biggest inspiration in your career?
So as an Irish woman of a certain age, probably Mary Robinson she's just so encompassingly, she was 9 when she became president of Ireland, and I think that as a kind of key, academic, lawyer, activist, changing the world type of person. But I think probably actually my biggest inspirations, going back to the very first question, were probably my friends. They went on and they did really interesting and exciting things and did big projects, and I was like, oh, okay, I can do that too. So it was less about looking at somebody sort of really senior, who I got excellent mentorship with various people, but I think it was actually the people around me who were doing things, and I was like, okay, I can do that. If they can do that, I can do that. We can do that. Maybe I'll do it with them. That sort of. So I think my friends, probably my many academic friends, I think probably.
The power of the community is always amazing. So what do you wish you could tell your graduate student self?
I think I would tell them that it's okay to not be in the big networked group, and not to go to all the big, so as an international lawyer, I've never been to ISIL or ISIL. And that, it's okay not to go to the things, just to network with the people who are just there to network with you. And if you're not asked to be in a million edited collections, that's okay. That's fine. You get on with the thing that's interesting and stick with the things that you think are interesting, because you do the best research in the things you're interested in, rather than what someone tells you is politically the best thing to write on or to research. You'll do better if you do the thing you're interested in, and let the what everyone else, the politicking, carry on. I mean, within the area, not necessarily, it's different for schools and stuff like that, but I think within whatever area of law that you're particularly in.
Awesome. If you could only read one book for the rest of your life, what would it be?
So I'm going to cheat. I'm going to go with an author rather than a particular book. So I think Ursula K. Le Guin. So I use her work as an academic. I use it in a work I do on Utopia with Ruth Houghton. But I've never read, whether it's a novel or a short story. Like there's an amazing short story called She Unnames Them that I would recommend to everybody who'd ever read in 10 minutes. And every time I read it, I get something out of her. She's just this incredible writer, writing with such an imagination, and like the best science fiction when it tells you about the world you're living in, and she does it incredibly well.
Excellent. If you had not been an academic, what alternative career would you have chosen? Although in the beginning you already hinted at practicing. So,
well, being a diplomat, I was never going to practice. So I knew I was never going to practice law. I was never. I was trying to think what else would I've done if I hadn't become a diplomat. I think probably probably public policy role of some kind of. I think that was always going to be, like, I can't imagine myself being a scientist or an accountant, or I mean I probably could be, but I'm. It's not something. So I think I was always destined to be in some sort of public policy type of position or role, I would say. But like, I'm not like, I was never going to be an artist or anything exciting, like or like professional marathon runner. It's never going to be me.
And the final one, finish this sentence. One thing no one talks about in academia is
constituted power. And the relationship with constituent power. And people should talk about constitutional power as much as they talk about constituent power. Because people go on and on and on about tyranny of the majority, and the majority this, the majority. And where does the tyranny always come from? The constituted power holders. So people need to look at beyond tyranny, just generally. Have a look there. Think about that as a system. I wish people would.
That's amazing. And that's a great answer too. So, Emilia, would you like to wrap up?
Just thank you so much, Aoife, for your incredible contribution. I think it has the potential to become one of those books that people want to have on their shelves as the only book to read for the rest of their life, because it's so accessible and so wonderful to read. So I cannot recommend it more to our listeners to go through the book. It's fantastic. It's thought-provoking. It's incredibly well written. So thank you so much for going through some aspects of the book.
And also, that's one of the few books that, whether you agree with it or not, it gives you a lot to think about. And these are the kind of books that we really need more of as a society. Just the kind of thought-provoking, you don't have to agree with everything. You can contest it, but at least it gives you a lot of meat, a lot of material to debate. So that's been amazing. Thank you.
And thank you very much. I really enjoyed doing this. This is really, really, I love this. Somebody's right from the time. I'm very pleased with that. So thank you very much. This is a really lovely time, really lovely way to think about my work and to talk about it. So thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And we are looking forward to seeing you in person, because we all based in the Northeast at some stage.
Hi, it's Aleksandra here. Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed this episode. If you like our project, have any questions, or would like to recommend a guest or a topic, drop us a line on just.theory.project@gmail.com. This season was made possible with the generous funding of Newcastle University. If you like, you can buy us a coffee. Your support will enable us to continue our work. Just Theory, changing the face of legal theory.